I want to talk about the collective West and how they're starting to come to grips with some sort of end game in Ukraine. And I don't mean that in the sense of some sort of specific time frame. I'm talking about various factors that they are beginning to understand inevitably lead to a specific end game. It could take months, it could take another year or two, but these are inescapable factors that are going to lead to a specific end game, and it's one that is not very favorable to them. And all of this is owed to logistics and military industrial output. And this is something many analysts have been talking about for months, actually almost a year now. As a matter of fact, I would say it became obvious when the US and other NATO nations announced that they were going to send NATO standard artillery pieces to Ukraine, howitzers, 155 millimeter howitzers, self-propelled howitzers in the M777. And at the time, I pointed out how these are new weapon systems. It takes months just to train an entry-level operator on them, takes years for experienced leadership within an artillery team to manage the individual weapon, to coordinate it together as a battery, and then of course operate that battery within the context of modern combined arms warfare. And then beyond training, there are all of these logistical considerations to take into account. You're sending not just M777s or M109 self-propelled howitzers, you're sending a whole variety of different systems, different artillery pieces, towed artillery pieces, self-propelled artillery pieces. In terms of tanks, we've already talked about that. We've talked about how the US is sending M1 Abrams, the UK is sending Challenger 2s, a variety of European countries are sending a combination of Leopard 2s, different variants of Leopard 2 tanks, as well as Leopard 1 tanks. You've got the AMX-10 RC from France, which isn't really a tank, I wouldn't say, a light tank. All of these tanks have different requirements in terms of training, in terms of maintenance, and that includes things like the optics, the engine, the fire control. They are all different. They all use different systems and components, and they'll all require their own individual supply chains. And that includes things like ammunition. The M1 Abrams and the Leopard 2 have a 120 millimeter smoothbore gun. The Challenger 2 has a 120 millimeter rifled gun, which uses its own special kind of ammunition that has to be sent separately from the ammunition for the Leopard 2s and the M1 Abrams. The Leopard 1 uses 105 millimeter rounds. The AMX-10 RC uses 105 millimeter rounds, but two completely different types of rounds that again will have to be sent separately. The T-72s that nations like Poland and the Czech Republic are sending to Ukraine use 125 millimeter rounds. Again, a completely different round. And this is all just to fulfill the requirement for main battle tanks on the battlefield. One type of weapon, but a multitude of weapon systems attempting to fulfill that role. All of this requires specialized training for the crews operating the vehicles on the battlefield and who attempt to maintain them there on the battlefield, and also for the crews to have to recover them and then send them 1,000 kilometers over the Ukrainian-Polish border, where they have to be repaired and refitted and then sent another 1,000 kilometers back to the front line. And they're sending this variety of weapons to Ukraine specifically because no single NATO nation and none of these nations collectively can send the same number of standardized weapons that the Russian Federation can produce for its armed forces. I've talked about how pro-NATO publications have noted that Russia is making at least 850 new and modernized main battle tanks every single year. And that is more tanks than NATO was able to scrape together. And again, there is a huge difference between 850 Russian tanks that Russia has years of experience operating and maintaining and sustaining on the battlefield, and this hodgepodge of tanks spanning decades that NATO is trying to send Ukraine to use. I've also talked about how the Jamestown Foundation put out an article attempting to ascertain the artillery shell production of the Russian Federation. 152 millimeter artillery shells, the equivalent of the 155 millimeter artillery shells NATO is attempting to send a steady supply of to Ukraine. And even with their flawed methodology, they conclude that Russia is making far more artillery shells every single year than the US or the EU, perhaps both combined. Now, my friend and colleague Angelo Giuliano sent me the link to this article here. This is from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. This is a US government and arms industry funded think tank, and it's titled Rebuilding US Inventories, 6 Critical Systems, and it's dated January 2023. And it says, as the United States transfers massive amounts of weapons, munitions, and supplies to Ukraine, questions arise about the health of US inventories. And then it shows this chart here. And look at the total time to rebuild these inventories. They're all measured in years, at least a couple of years, but also as much as between 8 and even 18 years. And even with surge rates, expanded production of these different weapon systems, it's still going to take years to replace. Now, the CSIS article concludes by saying, the bottom line is that military aid will continue and Ukraine will still be able to resist, but inventory replenishment will become an increasingly pressing problem. The Department of Defense has many tools to mitigate the problem of empty bins and will need to use all of them to avoid a slackening of military support to Ukraine. But these tools that they're talking about the Pentagon using are things like just emptying out all of America's inventories and all of Europe's inventories. Just send absolutely everything to Ukraine and not leaving any weapons or ammunition on hand for any other possible contingency. That is actually one of the tools CSIS suggests should be used. And there are actually already nations in the European Union that have begun doing this with certain weapon systems. They've sent virtually every vehicle of that type to Ukraine already, and they have nothing left for their own use. And we are actually seeing both the US and the EU resort to this in terms of 155 millimeter artillery shells. And they talk quite a bit about 155 millimeter artillery shells. They say current production is 3,250 per month. The DoD says that it can get that rate up to 20,000 per month, 240,000 per year by the spring of 2023, and 40,000 per month, 480,000 per year by 2025. At this surge rate, it would take about 6 years to rebuild inventories, allowing for normal peacetime usage and assuming no further transfers from inventory. And it also says even the 2025 surge rate would satisfy only a third of this need. They're talking about Ukraine's needs. To bridge the gap, other countries will have to provide ammunition, and a lot of it. I have already talked about the European Union and what the Western media has admitted regarding the limitations they face in expanding production. In other words, they really cannot. And I just saw an article about France announcing that they're going to double the amount of artillery shells that they are sending to Ukraine per month. They're increasing it from 1,000 shells per month to 2,000 shells per month. Now, to put that into perspective, Ukraine is firing 6,000 artillery shells per day, not per month, per day. So 2,000 shells over the course of an entire month. That allows Ukraine to fire for about one single morning of one single day out of an entire month. That's That's where France is, and France is one of the larger and European nations in terms of industrial base. CSIS also says, with the front line now mostly stationary, artillery has become the most important combat arm. Ukraine will never run out of 155mm ammunition. There will always be some flowing in, but artillery units might have to ration shells and fire at only the highest priority targets. This would have an adverse battlefield effect. The more constrained the ammunition supply, the more severe the effect. And we already see this playing out in places like Avdiivka and Bakhmut. It says, as an offset, the United States has provided 105mm howitzers and ammunition, 36 howitzers, and 180,000 shells. Because these shells are lighter and have a shorter range, the number of howitzers and shells will need to be very large to provide an adequate substitute. And I distinctively remember when I first saw the Pentagon list 105mm howitzers and ammunition instead of 155mm howitzers and ammunition, I immediately realized what they were doing. They were out of 155mm systems and rounds, and they're moving to 105mm systems and rounds, which is entirely inadequate. It is a substitute, but it is an inadequate substitute. So they have been doing this for months, and that means they've had a critical shortage for months and months. They also talk about HIMARS, the rockets, which they say more or less they can indefinitely supply at the rate Ukraine is using them. They're not really using them at a very high rate right now, and I suspect that's because they're out of launchers. They have a small handful of launchers left, and that's where all of these rockets are going. That's why they're not consuming as many rockets as they could be. Anyway, it says the United States has transferred only 20 HIMARS to Ukraine. Because numbers are so low and the production line is hot, replacement of the transferred articles will not take long. At the recent production rate, 3 years, and at the surge rate, 2.5 years. Indeed, DoD recently let a $431 million contract to Lockheed Martin for increased HIMARS production. Ukraine's challenge is that it has only 30 systems, including MLRS, to cover 530 miles, 850 kilometers of active front. That means just one system per 18 miles of front. Ukraine needs more. However, the United States has been reluctant to take systems from existing US units or to provide the heavier and more complicated MRLS system. I think they mean the M270. It's a tracked system that the UK and Germany and I believe some other European nations have provided in small numbers to Ukraine. And it also says that the DoD fact sheet cites 38 HIMARS launchers, but 18 will be new production and they will not be delivered for several years. Does Ukraine have several years to wait? I think it would be very unrealistic to think so. Then there's a section of the article titled Causes for Optimism and Pessimism. This is what it says. Most inventories are okay. These 6 systems do not represent, because they also talk about other systems, Stingers, the Javelin, and Excalibur GPS-guided artillery rounds. It says, these 6 systems do not represent the full spectrum of U.S. inventories. Most items provided to Ukraine have been in small numbers or from areas that have large inventories or production capacities. For example, the United States has provided 108 million rounds of small arms ammunition, but U.S. production is about 8.6 billion rounds per year, so this transfer is easy to accommodate. The United States provided 300 M113 armored personnel carriers, but has thousands available because the Army is moving to a different system. The United States has provided 276 tactical vehicles to tow weapons, but has tens of thousands in inventory. For most categories of weapons and munitions, the United States can provide support indefinitely. But small arms ammunition does you no good if the opponent that you face has an endless supply of artillery rounds. They will kill you before you even see them, let alone fire small arms ammunition at them. And then you have an endless supply of armored personnel carriers and combat vehicles that can tow weapons, but you have no weapons to tow. So what good does that do you? And then it admits replacement times for several important systems cannot be calculated because not enough data is publicly available. For example, DoD cites sending Ukraine over 46,000 other anti-armor systems, not Javelin, but types not specified, over 50 counter-artillery radars, various kinds, laser-guided rocket systems, unmanned aerial systems, and unmanned coastal defense vehicles. It might be that some of these systems have inventory challenges, but the data are insufficient to make judgments. But I could tell you with certainty that counter battery radar, or they call it counter artillery radar, counter battery radar is facing a severe critical shortage. They've already long since stopped sending them existing units from their own inventories, and they've been putting this item on contract to companies that can take 7 to 8 months to produce around 4 of them. I believe the last time I checked, there were 20 on order. That will take over a year to get to the battlefield. Russia is wiping these out much, much faster than the US is able to replace them. That is just a reality that they cannot get around. And I'm going into all of this in great detail. I'm repeating things that I've said many times over the last basically year now. And I've covered the CSIS article specifically because I wanted to present all of this information according to a US government-funded policy think tank, because I want to show you this article here from Asia Times, Why Ukraine May Embrace China's Peace Plan, recent private conference of top US foreign policy experts saw Ukraine at risk of losing a war of attrition despite West's best efforts. And I just explained to you why that is a reality. You can see the numbers yourself, and you can see CSIS and many others trying to come to grips with this. This Asia Times article is one that Alexander Mercouris already went over in great detail, and he made many excellent points, and I've included the link to his video in the video description below. But I just couldn't resist going over this myself because it is finally US policymakers who have been proposing increasingly absurd solutions to a problem they simply cannot solve. They're finally coming to grips with all of this. All of this that the Western media has collectively tried to paper over for months and months now, it's finally all coming out. This is what the article says. The several dozen attendees, many of whom had held cabinet or sub-cabinet positions, met under Chatham House rules, which forbid identification of individual participants but allow the content itself to be presented. And that's what the article is doing. And then regarding the overall conversation that took place, it says, overwhelmingly, the sentiment of participants leaned towards escalation in the form of providing additional weapons to Ukraine, of course. One prominent analyst proposed the formation of a foreign legion of fighters from other countries to supplement Ukraine's shrinking pool of trained manpower. This foreign legion is something they already did. They already tried doing that. We probably all have seen the New York Times article about how the most visible characters in this foreign legion turned out to be frauds, thieves. They spent about as much time fighting with each other as they did the Russians, if they even ever did manage to fight the Russians. And it turns out that only about 1,000 battalions worth of these foreign legion fighters are still there in Ukraine on the battlefield. So what do they mean by creating a foreign legion? They already did it and it failed. Do they mean just ordering NATO troops into Ukraine, wearing Ukrainian uniforms? And then even if they do that, with what weapons and with what ammunition? Because that is still going to be a problem. Actually, that is the main problem that they have, that they just can't get around and then draw the conclusion that they've lost this and they should cut their losses and quit while they're only this far behind. It goes on and it says the great majority of participants favored risking everything for absolute victory over Russia. None of the attendees mentioned the qualms that former President Donald Trump voiced on May 17th about the risk of nuclear escalation in Ukraine. The question of how the Russia-Ukraine war might escalate into a broader conflict received no attention. Their frustration, rather, was that Ukraine seems less likely to defeat Russia, even if the West makes the maximum effort and risks escalation. And this is very interesting. This is very interesting that they're not concerned or talking about or considering escalation. And I want to go back to this 2019 Rand Corporation paper titled Extending Russia. And under the section titled Providing Lethal Aid to Ukraine, this is what it says. Eastern Ukraine is already a significant drain on Russian resources, exacerbated by the accompanying Western sanctions. Increasing U.S. military aid would certainly drive up the Russian costs, but doing so could also increase the loss of Ukrainian lives and territory or result in a disadvantageous peace settlement. This would generally be seen as a serious setback for U.S. policy. It also says boosting U.S. aid as part of a broader diplomatic strategy to advance a settlement might well make sense, but calibrating the level of assistance to produce the desired effect while avoiding a damaging counter-escalation would be challenging. Well, this is obviously a challenge that U.S. policymakers were not up to, and they failed miserably. And that's why they call them top U.S. foreign policy experts. That's why they're coming together now, panicking, and that is the result that we're reading about here in this Asia Times article, which continues. And it says Ukraine has sustained 2/3 as many casualties as Russia, but with 1/3 to 1/4 of Russia's population is far less able to sustain them, according to one expert who spent many months on the ground in Ukraine. The entire army that NATO trained between 2014 and 2022 in preparation for Russian attack is dead, and recruits are being thrown into battle lines with 3 weeks of training, which again is wholly inadequate. As a entry-level U.S. Marine, your basic training is 3 months. 3 months and then an additional 1 month for combat training, or more than a month if you're on track to become an infantryman. It continues. It says, it isn't that Ukraine will literally run out of live bodies, but that the quality of its armed forces, enlisted men as well as officers, has deteriorated. Critical parts of the civilian economy will collapse as manpower is shifted to the military. This expert put Ukraine's unrecoverable casualties, killed or seriously wounded, at 2/3 of Russia's 120,000 Ukrainian dead or seriously wounded versus 150 to 200,000 Russians. But I've already talked about this over and over again, how this 150,000 to 200,000 Russian casualty figure is simply made up. There is no logical explanation for it. There is no breakdown. There's no supporting evidence of this. It also is contradicted by British state media, the BBC, who has an ongoing project counting Russian losses, and they provide the number of 16,000. And even if you doubled that or even tripled that, it comes nowhere near this 150,000 to 200,000 casualty figure. That is cited by the US government, also the Ukrainian government, and much of the Western media. Asia Times continues, well, if that number isn't even right, if it's actually reversed, if it's Russia suffering far fewer casualties, then the war of attrition is taking an even harder toll out on Ukraine. And so their conclusions that they're trying to draw based on this false information are even further from anything resembling reality. Asia Times continues. It says, the prospects for a breakthrough to end the stalemate along the line of contact are poor. The rapporteur continued. The expected Ukrainian spring offensive is one of the most anticipated maneuvers in military history, and Russia has had plenty of time to prepare defensive positions. And I've talked about how they have layered defensive lines stretching across the southern region, Kherson and Zaporozhye, but also across the Donbas region. Ukraine would need 650 modern main battle tanks. They will get nowhere even close to that many, and 1,000 armored personnel carriers to make a difference, in the view of one expert. Another former senior U.S. commander argued that the United States should send 1,000 Abrams M1 tanks to Ukraine, although he didn't explain from where they might be obtained. Ukraine should receive weapons that can destroy targets deep inside Russia, he added, and the US should get rid of the artificial boundary that says Ukraine can't strike into Russia. Russia is part of the battlefield. Now, first of all, it's not only where you're going to find 1,000 M1 Abrams, it's where you're going to find the crews to operate them. Each tank requires 4 crewmen, so 4 times 1,000, 4,000. Where are you finding 4,000 tankers in Ukraine right now who can operate this tank effectively on the battlefield? And the answer is nowhere. This type of manpower doesn't exist in Ukraine, and it will not exist in Ukraine, not as long as this conflict is taking place. So 1,000 M1 Abrams is just fantastical thinking. And again, remember, Asia Times says these are top US foreign policy experts. They are saying this, things that are completely fantastical. I also want to address this prevalent desire to ignore the consequences of escalation. It says, a foreign policy analyst who has advised the U.S. Defense Department noted that Putin can call up 1.7 million reserves if he has to. It may be fun to sink Russian ships in the Black Sea or to destroy targets inside Russia, he said, but it doesn't relieve pressure on Ukraine. Actually, it does the exact opposite. By attacking deep within Russia, by transferring weapons to Ukraine to use inside of Russia, and to significantly stir up the Russian population, you will be giving Moscow everything it needs to do another mobilization, to mobilize up to 1.7 million reservists. That's what you would be doing. And so it will just compound the quandary that Ukraine and its Western sponsors find themselves in. Because otherwise it would be very difficult for Moscow politically to do another mobilization, let alone one on this scale. It continues, it says, a former senior policy official proposed that the United States threaten China with sanctions to limit its support for Russia. Although sanctions on Russia haven't worked, China's a different case, he argued, because it is more integrated than Russia into the world economic system. Well, why did they do sanctions on Russia in the first place if they didn't think it was going to work? Obviously, they thought it was going to work on Russia. It didn't. It backfired. And now they're talking about doing it to China. And this time they're sure it's going to work. But how do they know it's not going to backfire even worse? It goes on and it says, there is a lot of anti-Russian sentiment in China, he added, and the Chinese people won't like the idea of accepting hardship to help Russia. Ukraine and China, he added, have a robust partnership going back decades. This spans between delusional and wishful thinking. I've had Mark Sloboda and Carl Zah on my channel at least twice talking about Russian-Chinese ties in the past and also present. They are very deep. They go far beyond simply facing this common threat the U.S. poses. But because the U.S. poses a common threat, I'm sure that China realizes this isn't hardship just for Russia. This is hardship for their own self-preservation as well. So again, the whole reason these top U.S. foreign policy experts are in this room panicking over what's going on in Ukraine is because they horrifically miscalculated going into this proxy war. And now they want to double down by not just continuing this proxy war with Russia, but now sanctioning China and beginning a process of confrontation with China as well, in addition to what they're already doing with China regarding the island province of Taiwan. Now, the author who wrote this wrote it anonymously, and he basically says during this discussion, what he added was that the U.S. should simply cut its losses. And He didn't say this directly, but it seems as if it was suggested that Vietnam humiliated the US. The US readjusted its foreign policy, and that's what allowed it to win the Cold War. And if Russia humiliates the United States now, maybe it'll allow the US to reorganize, readjust its foreign policy, and win the new Cold War against China, which I just don't think is going to happen. Now, the only way the US can get out of this situation it has created is if it readjusts its entire premise, its initial premise that it should hold hegemony over the entire planet, that it cannot allow nations like China to surpass it. This is entirely flawed. That's why any policy they try to place on top of that premise is inevitably going to fail. The only way the United States can continue functioning as a modern nation state, prosperous, with high living standards for its population, is if it accepts this reality that it's not going to stop China from surpassing it, that it's not going to impose itself upon all other nations, and instead cooperate with all other nations. Create a foreign policy predicated on multipolarism rather than being obsessed with unipolarism. And we've been seeing in the Western media stories about how China is refusing to have high-level talks with the US president or the US State Department. And the reason why is because China knows that this is what the US is doing. They've adopted this all or nothing policy. They refuse to allow China to surpass them. They will do virtually anything to stop China from surpassing the US. They understand the nature of the conflict in Ukraine. It is a proxy war against Russia. The US wants to eliminate Russia so they can isolate China. Why would China want to talk with the United States when the United States is not actually interested in talking with China? Their desire is to talk at China, to subordinate China and its national sovereignty under the US-led rules-based order. So why would they talk with them? There's no sense in doing that. It's a waste of time that China could use to talk with, and more importantly, work with, in a very constructive manner, nations all over the rest of the world. So that is the end game. Again, not in terms of any specific time frame, but in terms of factors that inevitably lead to Ukraine's defeat, at least according to this roomful of top US foreign policy experts. I just thought it was interesting how this more recent discussion reported on by Asia Times interlocks with this CSIS article from earlier this year. It's very interesting, and it's something that we have to keep an eye on. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other ways you can find and follow my work. Check the video description for all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel. I'm not ever going to. If you see an ad pop up, feel free to skip it because it's not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation or month to month, or even if you're just helping share my work with others, all of this is greatly appreciated. It's what makes doing this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.